Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Traditional Catholic Guy. We driving the bishop back to the airport, and he's going to be flying back to York, or Windsor, Pennsylvania. So one of the things we had a question about, at what point? Well, let me give a little situation. Currently, my dad is basically on, I wouldn't consider it life support, but he's on a ventilator, and he's pretty unresponsive, but he does seem to hear us, and he does make some reactions, but he's being fed through a feeding tube or whatever you want to call it. It's hooked up to his body. And
intervene.
It's okay. So we wanted to understand, or I wanted to understand, at what point in time does the church say that he's not able to sustain his life on his own, and we shouldn't treat him this way for the rest of his life, by
Right.
on the fetus. That's. I'm sorry, it was a long way of me saying that, but
Yeah.
that's what I wanted to understand. What the church is telling us about that.
Okay. So you're right. He's on a ventilator, and so the ventilator is just helping to give oxygen to him, so that he doesn't have to use the energy to breathe in as deeply to get the oxygen. So he's doing it on his own. And the other thing is that he's being fed intravenously, because obviously with the tube in his mouth he can't eat. And the problem, from what I understand yesterday, was that he did have these strokes, and the stroke seems to have impaired his brain function, at least temporarily, but they don't know. That's why they do this. They give this time for things to heal, kind of, to use the computer terms, to reboot and see what comes from that. But the first hurdle he has to overcome is to be able to breathe more fully on his own before they can do anything else. And so right now they're giving him time to see if that his breathing improves. And I understand it went from 12 to 20, which means 12% of his own effort and up to 20% of his own effort. The question is going to be about his ability, even once he's completely come as far as he can come, where he'll be. The other thing is, because of his age, maybe this is something that would also be considered. So the church says that a person in that state does not need to have any artificial means given to them. Of course, you would want to give them, like a man breaks his legs, crutches are an artificial mean, but you want to give them to him so that he can heal. But at some point, when you have a stroke, your brain has some kind of damage, and you find out what that damage is, you're going to see where it's at. I mean, medically, they could keep a person alive forever. They could basically.
That's kind of where I'm getting at.
Right, I understand. Yeah. So at what point do you make a decision that he's given enough chance, there's enough damage to him, that to be able to let him take over now, let that nature got him take over on his own and see what happens? Because people do die. So I know there's a lot of controversy about this, because there was like the Terry Shrive. There's other ones that have been kept alive for a long, long time. I know a personal case of a young girl who also has been basically kept alive for now 10 years. She hasn't recovered. She can't maintain life on her own. She has no consciousness. At what point do you say it's time for this person to come to God? It's always an individual situation, ethically speaking. Ethics is a moral act relating to a specific situation. I would say he's 92. He's had these strokes. He had some other problems. Most likely, the collapsed lung, which I think most likely came from the fact that a lot of times when people get older, when they swallow, they don't swallow completely, and it builds up fluid in their lungs. That's usually something then that you have to just keep treating over and over again. But eventually, the person gets very tired. You've heard me speak about Mrs. Smeltzer. Mrs. Smeltzer was in a similar situation, and the choice was to let her. She received, I think, if I remember right, she received oxygen for a while. But, she said, no, I'm anointed, the priest has been here. I just, it's time for me to go. She made that decision. Your father is able to speak. Other persons involved trying to not let go, holding on. But that's selfish. I mean, it's selfish. We want people to be with us. We do. We don't want to face death. We don't want to have that finality. But this is part of what it is to live with original sin and the effects of it. And as long as we're redeeming the soul, and as long as we are within the church, it's better when a person doesn't have dependence. If you're a 35-year-old man that has children still dependent upon him and stuff, that makes a difference, than a 92-year-old man who has had these problems. And, we still got to see where he is brain functioning once he's had time to heal, which is usually a couple of weeks. So until then, he's not on life support. So he is maintaining some himself. But I've seen these cases before where this has happened, and then the person they just die in their sleep.
Well, I hate to say that. I want my father to die, but I want his soul to go to heaven, and I want his pain to end. And I don't see what sort of life there is in him right now. And even if somehow he recovers some way, I don't see how he's going to be able to live any sort of life beyond being stuck into a bed for the rest of his life.
That's most likely what it would. So, it's got to be an act of selflessness to know that. Now, again, I know he has received spiritually. He is, like I said, 100% healthy spiritually. And physically, no. But spiritually, yes. And if we're focused on that our whole life we're working towards that. When it comes to these times, we're fine. It's a person who's not spiritually well, who's very, very sick, and physically dies, and now can do nothing to be spiritually healthy, that there's really a tragedy.
So let's say he's in this state for the next 2 weeks and really nothing's changed.
Correct. The doctors will speak to the person from the physical point and say, really, there's nothing more that we can do. He didn't recover this far. They came this far. What do you want to do? And you, from an ethical point of view, you could say, well, we want him to continue to have nutrition, we want him to continue to have water, which he needs to have. The respirator, since it's not breathing, he's not to keep those. And as long as he continues to live and breathe with air, food, and water, you can't take those things away from him, because that's what would kill him. So then you got to just but you can also say nothing more can be done. We don't want any more.
Okay, so you can say, all right, the doctor says, okay, there is nothing more we can do for him. And then they will ask if we want him removed from his feed, getting the food intravenously.
Right, but you can't do that.
That was my next question. Right. So we can't do that.
You cannot take the food, the water, or the air away. But if they said we're going to have to put him on a respirator that's going to now breathe for him, then you could refuse that.
Okay.
But as long as he's breathing on his own, as long as what he has now, he still has, and as long as then you need to continue to give him food, water, and air. Just think of those three basic things: food, water, and air.
Okay.
Okay.
So at this point in time, he might be in this state for quite some time.
Well, one of the other things to consider then is, as you saw, his breathing is labored. He's burning so much energy and so much just to keep that a person can't really maintain that for very long, especially on the intravenous food, because it's just the basic amount of nutrition that body is, in a state of non-movement. But he's, as he's breathing, you can see he's starting to breathe, and it's a lot of, even though he seems like he's laying there, there's a lot of energy and stuff, and people they get tired, day in and day out.
I understand. Okay. Well, thank you for that.